Welcome to Sable Island Conference 2021, a series of virtual presentations about the natural wonders and human history of this fascinating island. This is the last session in our series, The Cultural Importance of Sable Island, presented by Charles Burke. I am April Hager, Chair of the Board of Directors for Friends of Sable Island, a volunteer-run charitable organization dedicated to the long-term protection of all things Sable Island. We've been holding a biannual conference since 2015 as a major fundraiser for our education programs and especially our annual scholarships. We had hoped to hold it in person for 2021, but this proved too difficult with the pandemic restrictions. So we are happy to present Sable Island Conference 2021 virtually. In the public sphere, Sable Island's cultural importance leans towards its heritage as a humane establishment, which from 1802 was the impetus for building and maintaining the island's infrastructure of homes, barns, sheds, gardens, and lighthouses. Evidence of these structures, along with shipwreck remnants and artifacts associated with living on Sable, are tangible reminders of that cultural experience. However, since few have or will encounter these ruins firsthand, it is more likely the island's intangible cultural heritage will influence society's perception of Sable's cultural significance. This includes books, songs, performances, news articles, and even an event like this, where the Friends of Sable Island Society provide opportunities to communicate Sable Island stories across generations, crafting a sense of identity and promoting respect for the island's rich cultural heritage. Presenter Charles Burke spent 4 decades as a professional archaeologist with Parks Canada, working throughout Atlantic Canada and Ontario. This included 3 research and survey projects on Sable Island. He received the Queen's Diamond Jubilee Medal in 2012 for his contribution to archaeology and public education. Mr. Burke completed a Master of Arts in Anthropology from Memorial University of Newfoundland and is currently serving as a Director of History on the Volunteer Board of Directors for Friends of Sable Island. Welcome, Charles. Over to you.
Thank you, April. I'd like to just formally at the beginning here thank the Friends of Sable Island Society for providing me with an opportunity today to present some of the research that I've been working on. I don't know who is listening, if anybody even knows me, but I'd spent most of my life doing research on topics to do with my home island of Cape Breton. But after my first trip to Sable, I completely changed, and now I'm passionate about all things Sable in terms of getting some of the rich history that I have uncovered and discovered about Sable out to the public. So, what is the cultural significance of Sable Island? To begin with, we generally associate cultural significance with tangible things and places. In the case of Sable, we're likely to see the Humane Establishment and all of the evidence associated with it as the culturally significant components of its heritage. Evidence of these structures and the shipwreck remnants and the artifacts associated are all the obvious tangible reminders of that experience. However, most Canadians have never been to Sable and will never get to Sable. That leads me to wonder what their impression of Sable is. Perhaps more importantly, how their perception of Sable is shaped. What do they know about Sable? How do they know it? Personally, I believe it is based on the established storylines, and I think you probably know the ones I mean: shipwrecks, feral horses, sand dunes. While there is good reason to associate Sable with words like desolate, isolated, dangerous, and remote, their very meaning tends to dominate our perception of Sable Island. For better or worse, our idea of Sable is affected and shaped by the visual impact of photos and the mindful impact of books, stories, songs, poems, and literature inspired by the island. At the very core of the idea of Sable are the stories told by former residents who lived that history and contributed to Sable's cultural importance. While this presentation will generally focus on the tangible aspects of Sable's heritage, I recognize that few people will ever see the island's ruins and artifacts firsthand, and are more likely to have a sense of the island's cultural importance primarily influenced by the island's intangible cultural heritage. So what is that? In the 2003 Convention for the Safeguarding of Intangible Cultural Heritage, UNESCO defined it as the practices, representations, expressions, knowledges, skills, objects, artifacts, and cultural spaces recognized as part of the cultural heritage associated with a community. Intangible cultural heritage also includes the oral traditions, performing arts, social practices, rituals, festive events, traditional craftsmanship, and even the presentation of research in a forum such as we are participating in today. While there remains little to preserve on the island itself, the island's intangible heritage, its impact on our idea of Sable extends into the past, where a richly worded vocabulary, often accompanied by emotive illustrations of shipwrecks, horses, salvors, sand dunes, pirates, castaways, treasures, and ghosts, has, like magic, shaped how Nova Scotians understood and interpreted the island. As an archaeologist, I've spent 4 decades working with the physical evidence left in situ by people's past. And while a place like Sable has unique evidence and even rarer contextual issues, someone unaware of the island's tangible heritage may be overly influenced by its symbolic heritage, expressed in the art and tales of Sable that focus on the sea, danger, dread, fear, loss, and death. For many, Sable Island is an inhospitable place, an island on the boundary between earth and sea, land and sky, isolated and dependent, between the terror of the ocean and the peace of dry land. The remnants of Sable's history, regardless of time, attest to its global interconnectedness. From the very first accidental and curious excursions of mariners to the more recent drilling for oil, every act of exploitation and habitation has left its mark on this land. Some of these marks have, in a broader sense, also left their mark on the mindscape of Nova Scotians. Many identities of these past occupations remain either in the landscape or in photographs and stories. While much speculation is offered for the early history of Sable, it was clearly cited by John Cabot on a voyage to North America, and it was seen and named by the Portuguese explorer Fagundes in 1521. There are scant references to its presence in the 16th century, but as the Gastaldi map of 1565, from which we'll see that shortly, illustrates, early mariners were well aware of the danger of Sable Island sandbars. There were several attempts to colonize, or at least to occupy Sable in the early 1600s. While the Baron de Lery landed horses and cattle for a settlement that failed to materialize, the French Marquis de la Roche settled a small colony of convicts on Sable. This enterprise was fraught with suffering, starvation, murder, and the survivors were eventually rescued and returned to France 5 years later, providing perhaps the earliest evidence of an intangible story-based idea of Sable that will be updated and repeated to the present day. It also left the name French Gardens as one of the longest known names of a place on Sable Island. While there were several small occupations throughout the 1700s, organized by New England merchants, none of these endeavors became permanent. A significant historical event occurred in 1776, however, when the government commissioned hydrographer Joseph Desbarres to chart the waters around Sable Island. It took him 2 years, many boats, and considerable hardship to produce the chart, but its accuracy provided the first worthy glimpse of Sable Island. And the plan in the bottom right is the Gastaldi plan of 1565, and you can see that Sable Island exists as a magnificent sandbar which runs from the top north coast of Newfoundland almost all the way down to New England. According to one of the few histories of organized life-saving services for shipwreck victims, the first effort in the North Atlantic occurred with the creation of a volunteer society in Massachusetts in 1785, primarily concerned with shipwreck loss near Boston. the Society established huts of refuge along the coast, providing essential supplies in each for the relief of victims. The first government-sponsored life-saving station in the North Atlantic was, however, established in 1801 by Sir John Wentworth, Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia. This Sable establishment was the first of its kind and was conceived, organized, and made permanently real in Nova Scotia. Creation and funding of the Humane Establishment was a direct response by the government to the high rate of marine disasters and the plight of shipwreck survivors on Sable. There was also a concern with continual reports of unscrupulous wreckers who lured ships to the dangerous shoals of Sable Island to be plundered. The first superintendent, James Morris, moved to the island with his family and several workers in 1801 and began to build the precursors of the infrastructure you see in this slide. Although the first lighthouse was not constructed until 1861, the Canadian government of 1867 assumed responsibility for Sable Island and erected new lighthouses in 1873 at both the east and west ends of the island. This included homes and outbuildings for the lighthouse staff. Across the island, the Humane Establishment staff built numerous huts, provisioned with emergency supplies to sustain survivors until they were rescued by the horse-mounted patrols, which scoured the island after storms. At the establishment's main station, there were barracks and homes for shipwrecked mariners to live in until a government ship arrived to remove them to Halifax. At its peak, the Humane Establishment consisted of 5 stations located across the island and continued operating until 1958 when the lighthouses were automated. The following 1835 report from Captain Joseph Darby, the superintendent of the Sable Humane Establishment, clearly details the role and activities of Sable Island's life-saving station in a typical year. Quote, "Thus ends the year 1835, and with us it has been a year of great labor and fatigue. Our work has heaped upon us faster than we could clear it away. We have saved and shipped to Halifax property to an immense amount. The materials of 5 vessels and the cargoes of 2 have been mostly landed on the island by the establishment. Several tons of property have been carted over the island, some 14 miles and all reshipped, and there is now on the island between 2,000 and 3,000 pounds of property ready for shipping, besides as much more that was saved on the island and taken to New York. 109 persons have been saved and fed, some of them 6 weeks, and most of them 3 months and a half. An immense quantity of passengers' baggage has also been saved and shipped with them. Fuel has been collected in large quantities in 3 different parts of the island for the mutual comfort of the inhabitants and the unfortunate persons that may be thrown upon it. Signed, Joseph Darby." Throughout the 19th century, hundreds of shipwreck survivors were rescued from stranded and sinking ships, and hundreds more were washed ashore as victims to be interred in the island sand. For those who made it ashore safely, the discovery of huts with food, blankets, stoves, and dry wood must have seemed extraordinary. And when they were moved to larger homes in the main station, awaiting a ship to Halifax, they must have been grateful for the vision and purpose behind the creation of the Humane Establishment. The shipwrecks on Sable are the result of catastrophe and crisis, and the shipwreck remnants are found in the sand, in the margins of the beaches, and entombed in the dunes that developed around the ship's remains. Continual environmental actions, such as the aeolian and coastal erosion, burying, flooding, and re-exposure, create many opportunities to destabilize the wreck's cohesion and its preservation. This results in the decontextualizing of these marine resources. It is important to consider as well the necessity to collect and salvage wood for burning and building supplies on Sable in the past 2 centuries. Shipwrecks were frequently salvaged by the survivors as well to erect temporary survivor camps, and several were exposed in the 19th century, always rich in artifacts and evidence of these short-lived occupations. Although there is plenty of unmarked space on Sable Island, the landscape only looks empty if you equate emptiness to nothingness. The original main station, with the highest density of structures, activity areas, gardens, and people, was consumed by sand and abandoned for good by 1970. Excepting 2 sections of concrete foundations, it is difficult to find any trace of the community above ground. However, we will soon see what the main station forge looks like below ground. The landscape on Sable Island is constantly changing, and the human imprint on this land is forever subject to the immutable processes of nature. The island has numerous lost landscapes. Perhaps the most well-known is Main Station, where this slide details the steady encroachment of sand and the eventual abandonment of the entire area. At least much of this community remains below ground. Sadly, nearby, there are lighthouses, sheds, residences, barns, and all the associated evidence of living inundated and swallowed whole by the ocean, now scattered on the seafloor. The loss, discovery, and rediscovery of artifacts and features in the dunes of Sable Island is the result of a distinct and unique process associated with the ecology of a sand dune environment. To begin with, people lived on the sands of Sable. They built their homes, planted gardens, raised oxen, pigs, sheep, cattle. They built fences and barns and lighthouses. And they did this for 2 centuries, sculpting an existence on the island's dunes that mainlanders would never think of doing. Imagine for a moment a family is forced to abandon their home, excuse me, when drifting sands overtake their ability to keep the drifts from entombing their house. And you can see that happening in the bottom series of photos on this slide. There are barns, gardens, fences, sheds, middens, outhouses, as well as all the flotsam collected from the shores for future use, is encased in a new dune. Then, in short order, or maybe even a century later, the same aeolian erosion of dunes and deposition of sand can and will re-expose these objects and features, often leaving the evidence of multiple occupations and temporal divisions in a single newly deflated surface. From an archaeologist's perspective, the systemic context of the house and associated living areas are preserved only when the dune is stable. When the dune becomes unstable, for example, when the surface vegetation is removed, whether it is worn, gets eroded by a path, it becomes susceptible to rapid wind deflation, eroding the dune, depositing the sand elsewhere, and creating new ones. In the process, remnants of the house, all the associated contexts, artifacts, and features are exposed on a new surface with all trace of the original sand and soil matrix blown away. In a location like East Light, featured here, with its multiple buildings, multiple functions, and temporal occupation of nearly 2 centuries, it is common to observe artifacts from several areas on the newly exposed surface. And it is important to recognize that the process responsible for creating this jumble will rebury the context under a new layer of sand, and more importantly, will expose it again and again for as long as the wind blows. Consequently, archaeological evidence on Sable Island has been, is, and will be in future degraded by an array of ceaseless natural processes and human interactions, a perfect illustration of the ravages of time's arrow. Here at the site of the number 3 life-saving station located on the north side of Sable, mid-island, the remains of a single telegraph pole and a section of fireplace are the only reminders of another densely occupied and built environment. The process of wind erosion and its destabilizing activity on dunes is clearly illustrated here at the former densely occupied location of East Light, where the massive blowouts have exposed both architectural features and artifacts that were entombed by sand in the 1960s and 70s. That we can see these remnants today is purely a consequence of heavier materials, that is, metal, garbage, cement floors, concrete blocks, preventing any further wind destabilization. As shown here, almost 6 meters of sand has been blown away from this site, carrying with it all the organic and in situ strata deposited during the site's occupation. The red bar across the top is at the level, the walking surface when this house was a house. So it clearly shows exactly how much the wind has moved sand from this one area. As noted earlier, when discussing the cultural importance of Main Station, the best evidence of its use, occupation, and abandonment lies below the ground. In 2017, we utilized a ground-penetrating radar unit to assess much of this area. Now, GPR is a geophysical method, a tool really, that uses pulses of electromagnetic radar to detect and capture images of below-grade structural evidence. In this slide, the yellow polygons indicate the location of the Main Station buildings based on 1972 era photos. The red polygons show the survey zones that we ran the GPR recording machine through. What we see is this is over the forge, and it's difficult to explain, but the box with the 10 meters within it, that indicates the area above it is the concrete foundation for the floor of the forge, and the ripply area bound by the red bars on the diagonal on either side indicates the collapse and all the debris associated with the collapse and abandonment of the building off to the sides. Perhaps one of the most important realizations about the material culture found on Sable Island is the reflection that in the context of living there, you must bring what you need with you, and you must be handy with modifying and reusing those things which disaster has put on the shore. Life on Sable during the years of the Humane Establishment can be defined by an old expression, waste not, want not. If you look at this image, for example, you will see that they reused chips of broken brick in mortar when making the footings for a building. They poured concrete into an oak barrel and around an oak barrel to create an anchor for a signal mast. They include lumps of coal in the mortar for a foundation, glass and metal included in a piece of concrete that was the side of or the base of a building. And in the bottom right, within the circle, you can see that they actually used an old pot-bellied stove in the construction of this platform for a huge signal mast. I'm just going to show, there we have the stove. And 1 year after I took that photo, the collapsed platform has now completely obscured it, and we'll probably never see that stove again. At the site of the East Light, this picture shows the size and the extent of the material that has been left and abandoned there. Massive concrete blocks that were used for the base of the lighthouse, huge tools, large pieces of gears, lots of metal. The other side of this bridge is littered with the batteries. And at the bottom right, the curved piece is part of a cistern that was used to store coal for operating the fog whistle associated with the lighthouse. Now, one of the real problems we have with identifying the location of buildings, because everything, as you could see, is clearly destroyed and blown away, is looking at the function of artifacts that we find associated in particular areas. So in an area where, at East Light, where all of these artifacts, the pitchforks, the horseshoes, the wheels, they've all come from an area which we can now clearly identify as the barn location associated with the residences on Sable Island at East Light. So this is a really interesting way of being able to identify where the structures were located in the past. Wide array of general artifacts that have been located on Sable, from egg cups and ceramic fragments, spoons, tobacco pipes, brass spikes and nails. What's fascinating about the brass spikes and nails on Sable is that there are so many of them. They literally cover the beaches. They cover the residential areas as well. And in many cases, they are cut. And these are clearly from shipwrecks that have come ashore, wooden ships for the most part, because brass is what was used in the construction of these ships. They didn't rust, they didn't deteriorate, and they were all salvaged by the life-saving establishment people and reused on Sable. We even have one example of a large brass spike, which has been cut and repurposed as a chisel. In the bottom left, we have one of many. There are literally dozens and dozens of Radway's ready relief bottles across the shores of Sable. Now, because this was a pharmaceutical that was often used aboard ship in the 19th century, some of them may have come ashore that way. I would assume that most were used by the residents on Sable. Radway's ready relief was introduced in 1847. It was very popular throughout Nova Scotia and indeed throughout Atlantic Canada. There are ads in the New Glasgow newspaper where I found this ad said that it could transform a patient from a state of pain, misery, weakness, and decrepitude to the delightful enjoyment of health and strength. So this is pretty good for a medicine that was 98% alcohol. And as the ad went on to say, if you had any left in the bottle, it was good for horses too. So awash in artifacts and objects in places literally covering the sand makes me think of the childhood law of finders keepers. And I wonder how many souvenirs, how many artifacts and objects have been collected and removed from Sable's grip over the years. Although we recorded dozens of artifacts, we more broadly recorded the extent of these artifact zones. We only collected and brought back to the mainland artifacts that could tell a story. The slate, you can see on the left-hand side, the piece of slate that's been marked off, that is known as a deck slate. It's permanently marked as a reusable deck log to record a ship's hourly progress. And then you would take this below deck into the drier area and the information would be transferred to the paper record, the paper log. The porcelain doll's leg, statue of the Virgin Mary, pipe bowls again, horse hames, as you can imagine, are very common in the island, cooking pots, lead fishing sinkers, and another very important 19th century medicine in the top left corner, the cover of a Holloway's ointment, which was very useful and very well known in the 1840 to 1860 period in Nova Scotia. And it was used as a cure for inveterate ulcers, gout, rheumatism, a sore head, bad legs, burns, and ringworm. Finally, a small example of songs and poetry inspired by Sable Island. While my Sable research began with the discovery of things, the description of buildings and structures, and the demarcation on the land where these lost sites exist, I became fascinated by the number of songs, poetry, and stories associated with Sable. And I guess more explicitly, by the messages and images within that art. A graveyard strip of ship's bones, that beach with skeletons and cross trees, where the bars of sand are the hands of death, the native herds that still these wastes explore, the picket makes his solitary tour. There are no monuments on Sable Island, no plaques to identify the significance of a place. The dozens of homes, barns, and sheds are hidden below the marram and sand. Casual visitor, tourist, the island, is unlikely unaware of what they're walking on. Concrete and stone lighthouses are under the sea. Forget about finding the fences and gardens or the trails residents walked or rode for decades. No, the island is the final resting place of hundreds of shipwreck victims. Their resting places are unmarked, lost in forgotten parts of the island. And despite the hundreds of shipwrecks, the evidence today is scant. A steel boiler on the beach, wooden beams and spars in the sand, and a two-rear section of a wooden ship exposed in an eroding dune. But the songs and stories remain. Perhaps more than anywhere in Canadian jurisdiction, the documented and anticipated effects of climate change, sea level rise, erosion, and increasingly frequent extreme storm and wind events are certain to have a substantial impact on the tangible heritage buried in the sands of Sable. And it is going to be an almost impossible task to maintain and preserve cultural heritage at such risk. What is not at risk, however, is our imagination, our ability to observe facts and tell stories about the people who lived and worked in this marginal place. My interest in Sable Island began with the development of tools to record archaeological sites and moving these data from the field to a database. But in no time at all, I began looking for new stories to tell and believe the most important way to promote the cultural heritage of Sable Island is by telling and learning stories as we are today. I will end by asking, what is the idea of Sable Island? Is there one? It is so unlike the rest of Nova Scotia. Its occupation driven and sustained by such different currents. There were no forests to clear, no rocks to move. It is a place surrounded by ocean and the best fishing grounds in the world, yet it was not a fishing settlement. There are no harbors, quays, or wharves, no rivers, brooks, or streams, no rocky cliffs or stony shores. It was a place where the residents could never hope to claim the land they settled. To end at the beginning, what is the cultural importance of Sable Island? Well, as I hope this presentation makes clear, it is much more than the endangered ruins. There's no completed past on Sable, no fossilized Pompeii. Everything that exists in that dynamic place is either on its way to becoming archaeological data, or it already is. The tangible heritage of buildings, objects, and archaeological evidence is clearly important, but it is threatened, and there is less of it by the year. The intangible cultural heritage, the oral testimony, the folklore, books, painting, photography, performing arts, even our participation today in the Friends of Sable Island Society lecture series ensures the continual exploration of Sable Island's cultural importance. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Charles, for a very thought-provoking presentation on why many people find Sable Island so fascinating and why it is culturally significant. For those watching the recording, if you enjoyed this presentation, please consider a small charitable donation towards our scholarship program. For those attending the live session, we will stop recording now and take some questions.